Any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head shames his head. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled shames her head. The Apostle Paul says this in his first letter to the Corinthians, apparently commanding women to wear a head covering anytime they pray or prophesy in the church assembly. The passage may surprise you. While some Christian communities do have a tradition of women wearing head coverings, for hundreds of millions of Christians worldwide, this practice is virtually unheard of. So what exactly does Paul mean here? Is he really unequivocally commanding women to wear a veil whenever they pray or prophesy? And if so, why is this not a universal practice for Christians today when he states it so explicitly? Here's the whole relevant passage on screen. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 through 16. In this passage, Paul says women should cover their heads in prayer, and men shouldn't, and he presents an argument based on a gendered hierarchy for the Christian community. Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of the woman. Thus he reasons, any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head shames his head, but any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled shames her head. Paul then appeals to the order of creation, as found in the book of Genesis. For a man ought not to have his head veiled, since he is the image and reflection of God, but woman is the reflection of man. According to Paul, the priority of men is based on the fact that man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Here Paul is referencing the story found in Genesis chapter 2, when the first man Adam is created first, then the woman Eve is created from his rib. He then appeals to common sense, or at least what he considers common sense. Judge for yourself. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head unveiled? He's seemingly expecting the answer to his rhetorical question to be no. He then makes an argument from nature. Does not nature itself teach you that if man wears long hair, it is degrading to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. Paul expects his audience to agree with him that long hair is natural for a woman, but shameful for a man, and he seems to imply that humanity should follow nature's direction by having women wearing a veil, like how long hair functions like a cover. Now, to be clear, Paul is not being clear. I don't blame you if you didn't follow his argument. Paul's logic is difficult to understand and even contradictory, and some crucial terms that he uses are ambiguous. This is one of the most difficult to understand passages in all of Paul's letters, and scholars still debate what exactly he's trying to say. The New Testament scholar Craig Blomberg says this passage is probably the most complex, controversial, and opaque of any text of comparable length in the New Testament. The scholar Jason Badun says that Paul's argument is unusually fractured and fraught with structural problems. Another says the passage is so confusing that its original meaning may be beyond recovery. So don't worry, I'm swooping in to answer it once and for all. No, seriously, I'm going to try to summarize some interpretations that scholars have offered over the years and provide some cultural context, but the reality is this passage is notoriously difficult to understand, and we may never know what Paul actually meant. Over the years, the debate over the passage has been divided into two unequal camps. The majority position is that Paul is mandating literal fabric head coverings for women during prayer, or alternatively, Paul is talking about hairstyle or hair length, and he's not necessarily mandating veils. As I said, the former argument is the most widely accepted argument, so we'll start there. So what even is a head covering in this context? There were a lot of veiling customs throughout Greco-Roman history, and you see a lot of local variation from region to region. There were specialized veils as well. For example, the flammeum was a bright-colored bridal veil for weddings. The suffibulum was a veil worn by the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of the goddess Vesta. And Paul doesn't use specialized veil vocabulary in this passage, so we can't be 100% certain what type of head cover he had in mind, but we can try to reconstruct the context. Paul was writing to the early Christian community in the city of Corinth during the 1st century CE. At the time, the city was a thriving Roman colony with a multicultural population of Greeks, Romans, Jews, Syrians, and more. Given this diversity, women in Corinth may have worn different types of veils. However, since the city was heavily influenced by Roman culture, it makes sense to focus on Roman practice during the 1st century. In the ancient Roman world, what you wore was based on your age, gender, and social status. For adults, the basic dress was the tunic, or underdress. Over the tunic, married Roman women wore the stola, a long dress fixed with straps. Married or widowed women, and typically upper-class women, covered their shoulders with a palla, a large rectangular cloth that functioned as an outer garment like a cloak or mantle. The palla was the Roman equivalent to what the Greeks called the himation. When in public, women, and married women in particular, apparently, sometimes drew the palla over their head, forming a kind of veil. This is likely what Paul means when he tells his readers that women ought to wear a covering or a veil. A good example can be seen on the tombstone of the physician Claudius Agathamaris and his wife, who's depicted wearing her palla as a head covering. This family was from southern Greece during the 1st century CE, not all that far from Corinth, around the same time that Paul was writing his letter to the Corinthian church. This might give us a glimpse of what a head covering in Corinth might have looked like during Paul's lifetime. Though we're not sure how widespread this practice was across socioeconomic classes. It was most common among married and upper-class women, but it's unclear if lower-class women, enslaved women, and freed women veiled as frequently, if at all. The Greek philosopher Plutarch, writing a few decades after Paul, suggests that veiling was common in general, but not necessarily strictly followed, saying it's more usual for women to go forth in public with their heads covered. Head coverings were also typical for Jewish women, and Paul, as a Jewish man, was writing to a community that included both Jews and non-Jews. So Jewish cultural influence may be at play here as well, though we don't really have great evidence for what a Jewish woman would have worn in 1st century Corinth. A passage from the Mishnah on what women may wear on Shabbat implies that there was flexibility and variation from region to region. The early Christian writer Tertullian says, among the Jews, it is so usual for their women to have the head veiled that this is the means by which they may be recognized. And a painting of the baby Moses on the wall of the Dura Europos synagogue in Syria depicts a bunch of women wearing head coverings, presumably based on contemporary dress in the Jewish community in that city. Though these sources might not be all that useful for shedding light on actual Jewish practice in 1st century Corinth. Tertullian was writing 100 years later in North Africa. The Dura Europos painting is from Mesopotamia and dates to the mid-200s. So this data is far removed from Paul's context, both geographically and chronologically. Given the nature of our sources and the likelihood that Jews in Corinth had probably already adopted many aspects of Roman culture, scholars tend to focus on Roman fashion and cultural norms when reconstructing the cultural context of this passage. So what was the significance of women covering their heads? For the Greeks and the Romans, clothing communicated not only social status, but also moral status. The stola and palla symbolized a woman's modesty, with veiling serving as a visual shorthand for sexual virtue, norms of proper women's behavior, and morality. The Roman writer Nonius, for example, declared that the palla and stola were the clothing of an honest woman. The Roman historian Tacitus describes a generic virtuous woman, saying seldom did she appear in public and was always with her face partly veiled, either to disappoint men's gaze or to set off her beauty. Now, actual practice probably varied on the ground, as we've said, but Roman writers often suggest that married women in particular should appear in public only if their heads were covered. The 1st century writer Valerius Maximus, for example, mentions a Roman general who divorced his wife on the spot when he caught her in public without her head covering, declaring that her unveiled appearance in the presence of others was suspicious and improper. The law prescribes for you my eyes alone, to which you may prove your beauty. If you with needless provocation invite the look of anyone else, you must be suspected of wrongdoing. The implication here is that being uncovered not only brought shame on the woman, but also on her husband. But when we look at the archaeological evidence, it's possible to conclude that all of this talk about modesty, sexual propriety, and veiling was just talk, discourse about ideal women's behavior composed by conservative Roman men, an ideal that didn't necessarily reflect practice on the ground. Most artistic representations of women depict them without any sort of head covering, and often with super elaborate hairstyles that may not have held up well under a veil. This leads some scholars to question how strict this cultural norm really was. If veiling symbolized modesty or honor, why would these self-respecting women allow themselves to be depicted without it? Presumably the practice varied from family to family, with many women viewing it as optional. And as I've already mentioned, others have argued that veiling was primarily an expectation for elite women, and not enslaved women or women from lower socioeconomic classes. The scholar Tamina Terik bluntly states this is because their sexuality and honor was of little consequence to Roman society. Moreover, practically speaking, wearing a palla would have been super inconvenient for a manual laborer. It's a big piece of cloth draped around the body and pulled up over the head. So for an elite Roman woman, the palla not only communicated modesty and sexual virtue, but it also communicated, hey, I don't do manual labor. Now, artistic representations of veiled women do exist, but often when depicting a religious context, when they're performing something like a sacrifice. In these settings, men in particular covered their heads as a sign of piety and reverence, but typically high-status men, and especially a man taking an active central role in the ritual. For example, there are bunches of famous statues of Emperor Augustus, like this one from Corinth or this one from Rome, with his head covered during a sacrifice. This was the expected attire not only for the emperor himself as the Pontifex Maximus, but also for any man taking a central role in a ritual, from the emperor all the way down to the head of a household praying before a household shrine. For women, head covering apparently was more optional. Noble women and religious functionaries like the Vestal Virgins were expected to cover up, though artistic representations of women engaging in religious rituals sometimes show women without head coverings. The ritual procession on the Ara Pacis altar, for example, shows some women veiled and others not. So the head covering in Roman society could communicate several overlapping messages. For a married woman in a public, non-ritual setting, it signaled modesty and virtue. Dr. Tarek says the veil served a dual purpose, a badge of honor and a symbol of sexual reserve. According to Roman moralists, veiling symbolized a woman's sexual virtue. In a ritual setting like a sacrifice or a procession, it communicated humility and reverence before the gods, though in both contexts, head coverings were wrapped up in a hierarchical system concerned about honor and shame, which can help us understand this passage from 1 Corinthians. Although we don't exactly know what Paul was thinking, we can see these themes of shame, honor, and a hint of sexual propriety, modesty, and decorum influencing his thinking. Let's start with the context of Roman religion. The scholar Mark Finney suggests that Roman religious practices influenced Paul's views on head coverings, and may be the key to understanding this passage. Because Paul is not addressing everyday activities here, like going to buy food at the market. He's focused on head coverings during prayer and prophesying in a liturgical gathering. Paul says that men should not cover their head while praying, which, as we've seen, was the norm for men during religious rituals. Dr. Finney proposes that Paul wanted to avoid any association with honoring pagan gods. This passage directly follows a discussion of Greco-Roman gods just a few verses before in chapter 10. I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. So perhaps we should interpret this passage within the context of the letter itself, following a discussion of Greco-Roman gods. When Paul bans men from covering their heads during prayer, he might be countering what he viewed as a pagan vibe. Secondly, men typically covered their heads when taking an active central role in the ritual, and usually high-ranking men or the head of the household. Now, why would this be a problem for Paul? Well, throughout his letters, Paul envisions the Christian community as a new household of God. New Testament scholars call this fictive kinship, when Paul uses familial terms like my brothers and my children to describe relationships within the Christian community. He's not talking about actual blood relations, but rather a metaphorical family. Dr. Finney argues that head coverings could have disrupted Paul's vision of an ideal metaphorical family. Now imagine an early Christian gathering, where the cultural norm was for the main man, the head of the household, to put on a head covering when leading a prayer. You might have had a power struggle of high-ranking men trying to dominate the proceedings, or taking on the role of the head of the household, leading to resentment and rivalry. Paul may have recommended no head coverings for men to get rid of this status symbol of piety. Dr. Finney argues that Paul was addressing a few men in the Corinthian church who were following the Roman custom of covering their heads in the assembly, and possibly exerting social superiority. So what about the women? Again, Paul might have wanted to level the playing field in this metaphorical family. Remember that head coverings were typically worn by married and widowed women, and especially higher status women. The scholar Sarah Rudin theorizes that Paul wanted to get rid of status, saying perhaps the new decree made independent women of uncertain status or even enslaved women honorary wives in this setting. If all of the women in the congregation are wearing a head covering, you'd look out across the group of women from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell at a glance who was the honored noble woman and who was the enslaved woman. However, Finney argues that Paul was not being particularly radical. Women sometimes wore a head covering in a ritual setting, but it was more optional. So by mandating head coverings for women in prayer, Paul was actually being even more strict than the surrounding culture. Finney argues that even though Paul offers a radical new option for men, don't cover your head while you pray, he falls back on cultural norms for the women, possibly because Paul was sensitive to how outsiders viewed Christian worship. See, the Corinthian church included both believers and curious outsiders just checking it out. Paul explicitly says this a few chapters later when discussing speaking in tongues and prophesying. If therefore the entire church comes together and all speak in tongues, and outsiders or unbelievers enter, will they not say that you are out of your mind? This implies Paul cared a lot about outsiders' opinions concerning prayer and prophecy, and may have wanted to stick even closer to social norms in order to protect the community from charges of impropriety. And Paul may have also been concerned about impropriety before an angelic audience, not just a human audience. In verse 10, he says, "For this reason, a woman ought to have authority over her head because of the angels." If 1 Corinthians 11 is the most confusing chapter in the whole New Testament, this is the most confusing verse of that chapter. What does Paul mean by "because of the angels"? One theory is that ancient Jews and Christians thought that angels were present whenever they congregated for worship. We see this in some texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and elsewhere in the New Testament, angels are watchers of believers, and the book of Revelation mentions that churches themselves have angels. And so Paul could be hinting that angels joining the congregation would be offended at the women's unveiling as a disorderly ritual practice. But Paul might instead be talking about evil or fallen angels. Several scholars suggest that Paul is warning the Corinthians that these angels pose a sexual threat to the women, and the veil acts as a protective garment against their attacks. We learned earlier that in Roman society, a veil communicated a woman's sexual propriety and self-control. Remember that quote from Valerius Maximus about the Roman statesman who suddenly divorced his wife on the spot for failing to wear the veil. He complained that this was basically like her inviting sex. Much of Paul's letter to the Corinthians addresses correcting what he viewed as sexual misbehavior. Some Corinthians were allegedly visiting sex workers, another supposedly engaged in a sexual relationship with his mother-in-law, and Paul is urging the Corinthians to improve their sexual ethics, even suggesting refraining from sex entirely if possible. Paul may have seen the unveiled women as an instance of Corinthian sexual mischief. So when Paul says cover up because of the angels, he might be referencing Genesis chapter 6, when divine beings called the sons of God have sex with women and birth a race of giants called the Nephilim. Later in Jewish apocalyptic texts like the Book of Enoch, these sons of God are reinterpreted as the Watchers, angels who were tempted by mortal women. This mingling of angels and humans had horrible consequences according to Enochic lore, because their gigantic offspring go off and terrorize humanity and destroy property, leading to God's punishment of humanity and the giants through a worldwide flood. The Book of Enoch massively influenced early Christian thought, and Paul might be alluding to this when he prescribes the veil because of the angels. In this case, Paul is warning that unveiled women could arouse the sexual desire of angels and risk divine punishment. And some Roman writers do claim that the veil served a protective function. The poet Virgil, for example, states that Roman priests wear veils during religious rituals so that no evil-eyed enemy face can intrude. In this case, the veil serves as a barrier against outside supernatural forces. Now, while scholars still debate the exact nature of these angels, it's likely that themes of sexuality permeate this passage. In 2004, the scholar Troy Martin proposed a new, and some might even say eccentric explanation, suggesting that Paul's instructions on head coverings relate to ancient Greco-Roman beliefs about the physiological purpose of hair. Paul's concerns weren't just about modesty or decorum, but is based on the idea that hair, and especially women's hair, was considered part of the human sexual reproductive system. Ancient medical texts describe hair as playing a role in reproduction. According to these theories, hair was believed to be hollow and could draw in and store male reproductive fluid. To quote Dr. Martin, long feminine hair assists the uterus in drawing semen upward and inward. So assuming that Paul shared this ancient understanding of human anatomy, Martin suggests that his directives regarding head coverings were aimed at regulating what he perceived as an overt display of sexuality. Now, Martin's article has been heavily criticized by other scholars. In a response, the scholar Mark Goodacre debunks some of Martin's more novel translations, like how Martin translates covering in verse 15 as testicle, which really has no support from any other ancient Greek text. But even Goodacre concedes that the ancient medical data may shed light on what Paul and the Corinthian community thought about hair, as something sexual. Overall, we simply don't know Paul's exact reasoning. Maybe he wanted to differentiate the Corinthian community from pagan worship. Perhaps he wanted radical equality in this metaphorical family by erasing a status symbol both for men and women. Or maybe he wanted to address sexual misbehavior or protect women from lascivious angels that were watching. All of these theories have been explored in peer-reviewed research, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive theories. But the consensus is, we may never fully understand Paul's intentions beyond this general directive that women should wear head coverings while they pray and prophesy, and men should not. Though some scholars have even argued that Paul was not talking about head coverings at all, but was talking about hair length or hairstyle. Hairstyle theorists base their arguments on a few strands of evidence. Part of their argument rests on the fact that Paul uses very ambiguous language. While he does use the word covering in verse 15, he generally uses idiomatic phrases, like in verse 4 with the phrase, something on his head, or the verb unveiled in the next verse. Although these are standard translations of the Greek, some scholars have floated that these words are actually referring to hair. They argue that the phrase, something on his head, could be translated as having hair coming down from the head, and the word unveiled could mean with unbound hair. Proponents of the hairstyle theory also focus on verses 14 and 15, when Paul says, "Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is dishonoring to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering." Here in verse 15, Paul uses that preposition for in the phrase for a covering. This is the Greek word anti, which some scholars have argued could be translated as instead of. For her hair is given to her instead of a covering. So following this interpretation, Paul was not actually mandating a fabric head covering at all, but was actually talking about long hair as a substitute for a veil. However, the hairstyle theory has not convinced most scholars. The scholar Preston Massey, in my view, has demolished this theory. Those new translations of the Greek in verses 4 and 5 are not reflected in other Greek literature, and modern translations like the NRSV have got it right. As for his confusing statement in verse 15, well, Paul spends 13 verses where he seems pretty clear that he's talking about the necessity of a fabric head covering before he then throws in this comment. But to quote Preston Massey, one verse cannot withstand the cumulative weight of the 13 previous verses. If Paul means long hair can replace the need for a head covering, this would create a puzzling reversal of thought and seemingly overthrow the arguments advanced in the previous 13 verses. Rather than assuming that Paul is overturning his own argument in a single phrase, I'd agree with the scholar of early Christianity, Jason Badoon, who says that Paul is making a poorly articulated side argument here to bolster his opinion, a proof from nature. He spends 13 verses saying that women should wear a veil, and then is like, you want more proof? Nature itself gave women long hair, which is kind of like a veil, so it's hardwired into humanity. Another scholar summarizes it like this. Civilization should, to some extent, complete the work of nature by following the direction indicated by nature. We can criticize this argument from nature as weak or even incoherent, but he seems to propose this analogy as further evidence for why women need veils, not a statement that hair can replace a veil. All this to say, the hair length, hairstyle interpretation truly is on shaky foundations. Paul is almost certainly talking about fabric head coverings. So what about Christian practice today? We can say with near certainty that one of the texts found in the Christian Bible mandates that women should cover their heads when they pray, and men should not. And even though Paul was responding to very specific concerns and challenges in a specific Christian community, and though his writing reflects his ancient social ethics, ancient angelology, and maybe even ancient understandings of human anatomy, you would think that this passage would apply universally to Christians today. And at various times and places throughout history, Christian women have worn veils or other types of head coverings during religious gatherings. These groups often cite Paul's letter to the Corinthians as scriptural support for this practice. It's especially common among various branches of Orthodox Christianity, holiness congregations, and groups practicing plain dress, like plain dressing Mennonites and the Amish. In the US, it's also common to see Christian men, particularly evangelical men, to remove their hats during prayer, presumably following Paul's parallel mandate for men not to cover their heads during prayer. But why do so many millions of Christians seemingly ignore Paul's head covering mandates? While his reasoning is ambiguous, his instructions are pretty clear. We often assume that if a sacred text says X, Y, or Z, then contemporary practitioners will do and believe X, Y, and Z. In other words, we expect that the instructions, practices, or beliefs outlined in a sacred text to be directly reflected by modern practitioners. But religions cannot be reduced to the contents of their sacred texts. As the biblical scholar Dr. Dan McClellan says, we negotiate with the Bible to make it useful and meaningful to our social identities. In other words, Christians interpret and adapt biblical teachings to fit their contemporary lives. You may have heard the phrase common among evangelical Christians. The Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. But this phrase misses a very crucial step. The Bible says it, I interpret it, I believe it, that settles it. And sometimes that interpretation is happening without the reader even realizing it. This is true no matter the religion and no matter the religious text. Contemporary readers of a sacred text are arriving at that text not only with their own interpretation, but often an interpretation refracted through the lens of a centuries-long commentary tradition. Centuries of theologians offering interpretations of texts that then influence the next generation of interpreters. This chapter is one of the best examples of this negotiation process. Despite Paul's clear mandates, modern practices vary widely, showing how contemporary Christians navigate and negotiate their beliefs and practices in ways that reflect their current cultural and social contexts, rather than a strict, uncomplicated reading of their sacred text. If you've been watching me for a while, you'll know that I'm a creator over on Nebula. Nebula is an independent streaming platform owned by us, the creators, and it's made to address the limitations that we face when publishing videos on YouTube. YouTube's content policies and algorithms can push creators to conform to trends or to avoid sensitive topics, but as an ad-free platform directly supported by you, the viewers, Nebula is a place where we can produce content without these constraints, which promotes really creative and diverse original content. So for example, some of you might be fans of Wendover Productions' travel-based competition show Jet Lag. Well, they just launched a new show, The Getaway. It features 6 Nebula creators on a great American road trip as they try to weed out a snitch trying to sabotage the prize money. And you know how some of those game shows have one saboteur? Well, the twist here is that everyone is the saboteur and they don't realize it, which is just hilarious. The first episode was just released, so go check it out. Nebula has a ton of exclusive series like this, and we're adding new ones all the time. There's Modern Conflicts by Real Life Lore, Archaeology Quest by Real Science, which brings you a fun dose of experimental archaeology that you never know you needed, and the upcoming documentary Boomers by Tom Nicholas, about why world leaders these days are just so dang old. We also recently realized that so many of our creators were covering world events, and we wanted to create a system that would take that responsibility more seriously. So we launched the Nebula News category. The news page is curated by the TLDR News team, who will be working to find more videos and creators to keep you more informed about what's going on in the world. If you use my link nebula.tv/religionforbreakfast, you can get Nebula for a 40% discount off of their annual plans, which are a great deal at a little over $2.50 a month. And if you want to share Nebula with your friends and family, Nebula is now offering annual gift cards. Use the link here on screen to give a year of Nebula to a friend for just $30. Thanks, everyone.